So this week we're going to look at the legislative branches of the different states. They all have similar setups to the U.S. Congress, but there are differences among the 50 states as well. And your textbook goes through some of those. So we're just going to look at the high level, very broad comparisons and look at some of the commonalities between them. So there are four functions of the legislative branch. The first one is the one we probably think of the most often, which is lawmaking, since the legislative branch has the power to make laws. They also have the power of oversight of the other two branches of government in the whole checks and balances, as well as agencies, bureaucracies, as far as budgets and appropriations in particular. They're also representatives of the district as well as the constituents within that district, tied to the lawmaking process, but also a separate function that they serve, and tied to the last one as well, which is constituency service. This is generally their favorite because it's a good way for them to show or demonstrate that they're doing something very specific for members of their district. So I've got a good example here, Representative Price from North Carolina. So he serves in the U.S. Congress, so these are federal examples, but they would be very similar at the state level. So he's got 10 good examples of what we mean by constituency service, and basically anything that relates to the government that you might need help with, you can reach out to your representative who can then help you navigate or maybe try to resolve issues. So tied to the lawmaking process is policy setting or agenda setting. So the legislative branch is the most democratic of all of the branches. They basically run by majority rules. With two parties, it would seem like one party would basically kind of be getting their way within the legislative branch, but as we talked about with parties, they're not as cohesive, right? There's a lot of variation, a lot of disagreement. So even with a two-party system, we still usually need some sort of coalition building or log rolling in order to get legislation passed, in order to get over that hump of getting that majority of votes for it. These are often done through riders or amendments to bills. So oftentimes, something will get added to the bill based for a specific district, so usually some sort of grant or some sort of funding that will go directly to a district in order to get that representative of that district to vote for a bill. It also can be something as simple as, hey, if you vote for my legislation, I'll vote for yours. Riders or amendments can also be used sort of in a negative sense as well. This is kind of at the congressional level, happens quite often, but amendments will get added that then make it the bill less desirable, or put something within the bill that they know certain representatives are not going to be able to vote for the bill because of that. How amendments work, what the rules are, amendments vary. So much like at the federal level, the House of Representatives and the Senate have very, very different rules for this. And that's true across states as well as probably between the different houses as well. And one of the variations on that is the filibuster rule. So some states allow filibusters, much like as it takes place in the U.S. Senate. And of course, there can be different rules around those, and what the exact rules are will vary from state to state. Filibusters, for the most part, are meant to well, they're essentially meant to distract or to stop a bill from getting passed. Usually what they end up doing is actually just delaying. Unless you're at the end of a legislative session, in which case every new legislative session requires bills that didn't get passed in the prior session to start all over again. That's about the only time a filibuster is really going to be effective in stopping legislation from getting passed. So not only is compromise needed within the legislative branch, but it's also needed with the executive branch, and particularly the governor, who usually has to sign off on legislation before it becomes law. So most states have chosen to kind of copy the federal legislative branch, and they have bicameral legislatures, which creates internal checks and balances. And the reason why is because the members of the two houses are set up differently. So what would be equivalent to the House of Representatives is generally more responsive because they're usually elected every 2 years and their district size is usually much smaller. The Senates are more deliberative because they serve a larger district size, and then they're usually elected for longer. At the state level, it's usually 4 years as opposed to the federal level where it's 6. And this slows down the process because, again, you have different members who are reacting or responding differently to them. So parties really play the largest role in the legislative branches, and that's because of the party caucuses, which as a result of the party caucuses, leadership roles as well as committee seats and chairs are selected. So the party with the largest caucus gets to decide the top leader positions as well as the chairs, and parties for both sets of parties determine who gets to serve on committees based on, people from their parties that caucus with them. So it is important to some extent to follow along the party lines, even though, again, you don't see everyone falling necessarily lock sync with the parties. You are limited in what options you get. So those who are seen as more closely aligning with the party or working with the party, moving towards the party goals, are going to be more likely to get leadership roles. They're going to get the preference when it comes to committee positions and things like that. So parties help to coordinate lawmaking, try and get, again, everyone within the party voting in the same thing. As we talked about during the party chapter, right, they also do a lot of fundraising and help in that regard as well. There are other types of caucuses, since caucuses are basically just any sort of group that has a similar commonality, common goal. So there are other types of caucuses, but the party caucuses are the main ones that sort of run the legislative branch. As mentioned, parties are very important for leadership roles, but so is incumbency. So being in office a long time is more likely to lead to a leadership role, whether it's in the full House or a committee chair position. So being in office a long time definitely helps, with the exception of the 2 states that currently have term limits. Then, of course, it's not going to be as much of a factor, but there are other factors at play in those cases. I've highlighted the 2 highest positions. Most use similar names to Congress. So you have a Speaker of the House is the highest position in the House, and the President of the Senate is the highest position in the Senate. Again, there are some different names in different states. You also have majority, minority leaders, majority whips, minority whips, and there can be other types of leadership roles as well. Anyone not in a leadership role is known as a rank and file member, so you may hear that term used from time to time. There are different philosophies about the role of members of a legislative branch, whether they're delegates or trustees. So delegates view themselves more as being delegated to the role and really representing the direct wishes of those that they represent, and so kind of being just an extension of those who their constituents. Whereas trustees view themselves more as being trusted in that role to make the decision based on their own conscience and their own what they believe is the right or wrong choice for each vote. So you can see how the difference in those philosophies would lead to differences in how members would vote. There's also differences in how the membership is set up. You have professional versus citizen legislatures and full versus part-time. So Illinois has professional full-time legislators, but you have some other states where they only considered to serve part-time. They still maintain their jobs and their careers, and so when they're not serving in the legislature, they actually go back to that, and they probably spend as much, if not more, time in their roles as just everyday regular citizens, as opposed to those who are viewed as full-time professional legislators. So getting to select the committee that you want to be on is important because most legislative work is done at the committee level. It's impossible to to negotiate things at the full legislature level. You have to have it in the smaller groups. So committees or even subcommittees often are where most of the work is done in writing up, marking up, as well as negotiations over the legislation. It takes place there before it's then sort of voted out or sent out to the full legislature to be voted on. The book gives you one example of legislation passing through a state process. I'm sharing a different example, Oklahoma. I like this example in particular because of all the stop signs along the way. As you can see, the process is very complicated, and then there's multiple places throughout the process where legislation just gets stopped. And when it gets stopped, that means it's basically dead. Legislation gets stopped, and you have to start all the way back at the beginning in order to get something passed. And you can see multiple opportunities in places for legislation to get derailed. At the congressional level, only about 5% of all bills that get submitted actually get passed by Congress and signed by the president to become law. That is higher at the state level, varying by state, varying by year and different things. It may not be much higher. It could be significantly higher, but it's pretty safe to say the majority of legislation that gets submitted to legislative branches do not make it to ever become law, as they die somewhere else along the process. Malapportionment is a very important topic, and we're not going to have a lot of time to discuss it. Your book does a good job as well. I did include some video links so you can kind of find some more information. It mostly focuses at the federal level, but the concept is pretty good. And really, it's state legislatures decide congressional legislative districts as well. So while these focus on the federal legislative districts, it is state legislatures that are making those decisions. So apportionment is basically how are states divided up to determine the representatives for their state, whether it's at the state level or the federal level. Malapportionment is when it's not done correctly. So it's done in a way that hinders or hurts a group of people. So redistricting takes place every 10 years after the U.S. Census takes place and populations are readjusted for the U.S. House of Representatives. And states do have some similar sort of way of doing that within their state as well, because as mentioned before, the Supreme Court requires state legislatures to be based on population for both houses. Therefore, they're required to do that within every 10 years in order to make sure that they're both within the state and at the congressional level, that the districts are equally represented. So gerrymandering for political reasons is okay for the most part, at least to this point. There are quite a few cases that are going through. It's becoming a little less clear. The U.S. Supreme Court hasn't really weighed in, but up to this point, it's been okay to gerrymander. And if you don't know what gerrymandering is, you can watch that video link. But it's that picture over there on the side explains one of the first times where this was done by a politician whose name was Jerry. And so it's okay for them to set up, again, as of today. It's also okay to gerrymander or set up districts that have give a minority racial group an advantage. It's not okay to disadvantage a racial minority group. So as mentioned in the previous slide, it is actually okay to create districts that are viewed as giving an advantage to a racial minority group. So Illinois' 4th Congressional District is an example of this. It's often referred to as the earmuff district, and if you turn your head to the left, you can probably see why. So if you kind of notice, it's a little hard to tell, but districts have to be continuous lines. That's one of the requirements. These are really two separate boxes, because the line that you can't really see follows Interstate 294. There are no houses, there's no property on either side of Interstate 294 that are included in this, but they basically drew the line down this interstate in order to connect these two different groups. And basically what you see is the earmuffs are Hispanic districts. And so they have drawn this district in a way that you have a majority Hispanic congressional district in the state of Illinois. And again, at this point, that has been viewed as acceptable. So for the most part, legislative branches have a fairly low approval rating. Again, it varies by state. Congress always has been running a fairly low. I mean, if they can hit 20% approval, that's actually pretty good. There's some bumps, and as you can see from the graph on this slide, which I just pulled out, it's kind of an older one, but I like the way it looks because it helps to raise the point that congressional approval is fairly low, but despite that fact, most people running for re-election generally get re-elected because we individually rate our representatives high while rating the legislative branch very low. And this is true, again, at the state level as well as at the congressional level. Some state legislatures might have some higher approval ratings than others, but some are just as low as the congressional level. And again, high approval for your individual representative is partially due to constituency services, being able to see how they help and individually help you, whereas some of the negative things can be seen from some of the earmarking, the pork barreling, giving the negotiations that take place between districts, as well as the fact that, right, you voted for your member, so you believe and trust in them, but you didn't vote for the other members, and that's a lot more, right? So there's a lot more members in a legislative branch that you didn't vote for and that you may not have trust that they are going to have what's best for you. So into that sense, it kind of makes sense that approval as the whole body would be a lot lower than approval of an individual member. So this idea is even furthered by what we think they do, or more importantly, what we think they don't do. And there's a perception that legislative branches don't do anything, right? That they don't do the work, they don't compromise, and so they don't get legislation passed. Again, if you're looking at during the pandemic, you see a lot of governor actions, a lot of things talked about the governors and emergency powers, because legislative branches didn't act or give governors power or pass major legislation requiring it, so governors were using emergency powers and mandates to do things. And so this sort of leads to the idea that the legislative branches don't really work, or don't get things done, or that they can't work together, or they can't work with the governor. And there is some truth to that, is somebody who's running for re-election, especially if you're running every 2 years, you're going to be, maybe a little cautious about certain things and how that's going to look within your district. You may be less willing to pass some things that are seen as maybe the general good, but not very popular within your district. You're also seen as often as causing more problems when they do actually pass legislation, and this is because you're more likely to pay attention when something affects you, especially when it affects you negatively, than you are when it doesn't affect you at all, or when it affects you positively. So you're a lot more likely to pay attention to what a legislative branch is doing when a law gets passed that it negatively affects you, and therefore, again, a perception that when they do pass legislation, it creates problems, it creates hardships rather than helping or improving things. So you're going to look at some of the rules currently in place in the Illinois General Assembly. Let's say a few other key things to highlight. The legislature is really controlled by the legislative leadership, the governor, and unelected staff. Regular rank and file members don't have a lot of power within the Illinois General Assembly. The leaders are known as the Four Tops, and each one has their own caucus PAC, which means their ability to raise money and donate it to those who are running for re-election. Therefore, it's important that you stay on the good side of the leaders within the Illinois General Assembly. Committees at this point are pretty much meaningless as they can be replaced at will, including the chairs of the committees at the will of the speaker. So the speaker really has final authority and say as far as legislation and agenda setting within the Illinois General Assembly. And you'll look at a few other specifically of the rules and how it affects legislation, and you can decide for yourself which ones are helpful and which ones might be hurting us.